For soldiers in the Continental Army, every winter during the American Revolution was tough to endure. The Valley Forge winter of 1777-78 is probably the most well known and was definitely a tough winter. But the winter of 1779 to 1780, known as the Hard Winter, where the Continental Army spent in Morristown, New Jersey, was probably the Patriots' hardest test throughout the entire war. This winter tested the wills of even the strongest patriots. Washington picked Morristown, New Jersey for his winter encampment for several reasons. Located between Philadelphia and British stronghold New York City, Morristown provided a strategic location for Washington's army to make camp. The camp would be at least a 2-day hike for British forces in New York City and was naturally protected by the Watchung Mountains and the Great Swamp. Local streams provided water for drinking. Morristown was a crossroads community, providing routes in multiple directions, but not too many routes in which it was hard to defend. The town was surrounded by farms and was a center for farming and timber, which in theory would provide Washington's army with necessary resources for the winter. This wasn't the first time that Washington picked Morristown for his army's winter encampment. He picked Morristown in the winter of 1776, following Patriot victories at Trenton and Princeton. Even though there was some fighting going on in the South during the winter of 79-80, the bulk of the Continental Army, about 10,000 troops, entered Morristown in December of 1779. They settled in a mountainous region called Jockey Hollow. The Continental Army cut down thousands of acres of timber to construct a log house city of more than 1,000 wooden structures that would accommodate 12 men each. Everything sounds good to this point, right? A location that they used before that had ample resources to feed and shelter the troops, which was also strategically placed. So what went wrong? The first issue was the weather. Extreme cold proved to be one of the Army's greatest trials during the winter at Morristown. The 79-80 winter was one of the coldest winters on record. Morristown received 28 snowfalls that winter, with some blizzards leaving up to 4 feet of snow in its wake, with snowdrifts piling up a lot higher. Given the coldness of the winter, the snow didn't have many opportunities to melt, and it just kept piling higher and higher after each snowfall. This is what Washington wrote about the winter.
The oldest people now living in this country do not remember so hard a winter as the one we are now emerging from. In a word, the severity of the frost exceeded anything of the kind that had ever been experienced in this climate before.
I guess that's why they called it the hard winter. Even with 1,000 log huts being built, the soldiers still struggled with the cold due to a lack of winter supplies like adequate clothing, footwear, and blankets. The Continental Congress had a hard time funding the army and couldn't provide the soldiers with adequate winter clothing, and what supplies they could scrape together couldn't get to Morristown due to the icy roads. When old shoes became unwearable, they were replaced with rags. It wasn't only the soldiers that suffered. Some soldiers had their wives and kids join them, making the conditions more cramped and the need for supplies greater. Winter clothing wasn't the only thing that the soldiers lacked. There was a severe lack of food as well. Soldiers would sometimes go a few days without eating, and some resorted to eating tree bark, leather from old shoes, or even dogs. So how can a winter encampment, located in the middle of a whole bunch of farms, struggle for food? A drought had created shortages in the harvest season before, and farmers were unwilling to give up crops to feed the soldiers. The farmers were also reluctant to take the newly formed continental currency, since it fluctuated in price greatly and just wasn't a trusted form of currency yet. During the winter, inflation of the continental currency got so bad that it would take almost 50 continental dollars to buy something you can get with one silver dollar. Washington, who had his headquarters in the Fort Estate a few miles away, pleaded for help to anyone that would listen, from the Continental Congress to locals, but little help came. The food situation got so dire that Washington permitted the confiscation of grain and cattle from nearby properties in order to keep his soldiers alive. If all this wasn't bad enough, many soldiers had not been paid in months, adding to their frustrations. As you can imagine, soldier morale was very low, and there were a lot of talks of quitting and mutiny amongst the soldiers. Numbers in the camp dwindled as the winter went on. Of the 10,000 troops that entered camp in December, 8,000 left in June. About 100 soldiers died that winter. Over 1,000 deserted the camp, while many others didn't re-enlist when their enlistments were up. Enlistment contracts were constantly being disputed between the soldiers and the government since many of the soldiers couldn't read. In the spring, there was a failed mutiny attempt from the Connecticut line. Washington knew the fate of his army was in the balance and tried everything in his power to keep his army together. I'm sure that's why he made such harsh decisions, like confiscating food from the locals. In May of 1780, the Continental Army got a big boost when Marquez de Lafayette visited Washington and Morristown to tell him the French would send additional forces to help the Patriots. Washington's army survived the hard winter and were finally able to break camp in June of 1780 and went on to win several key battles. The winter encampment at Morristown became an important symbol of patriotism and persistence in the American Revolution. They held together in spite of conditions that threatened to tear them apart. The Continental Army's perseverance and determination to overcome the challenges they faced prepared them for the battles that would eventually secure American independence. Thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate it. Please subscribe for more historical videos. Take care.